We're really excited today. We have a great guest calling in for an interview with us, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Campbell. And Mr. Campbell is a retired applied nuclear physicist, formerly works for NASA. And applied, I say applied because that means he was more than just a theoretical physicist. He actually worked in the field. He also was a contractor with the Department of Defense, and he worked with the Army Intelligence for over a decade. And along his travels, he met up with a man by the name of Bob Monroe of the Monroe Institute in Charlottesville, Virginia. And upon meeting him, he learned that Mr. Monroe was looking for some scientists to help him study altered states of consciousness. So Tom applied for the position and subsequently began working with Bob Monroe. He has been a serious explorer of the frontiers of reality, mind, consciousness, and psychic phenomenon for the last 35 years. He's the author of the book, My Big T.O.E, which stands for Theory of Everything. It is a trilogy. It's a book that claims to unify general relativity, quantum mechanics, and metaphysics, along with the origins of consciousness. And today he lectures internationally about his theory and model of the world, which basically posits that we are all living in a virtual reality of sorts. And so today we're going to be discussing that from him, where our consciousness comes from, how it works, etc. And we're going to dig into all of that. So hello, Tom, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here today, and welcome to the interview.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, did I leave anything out? Is there anything else you wanted to share with us about your past? Or?
No, I think you encapsulated it very well. Thank you.
All right. Well, so basically the model that you have come to this conclusion about is basically we are living in this virtual reality. And so are we to believe this? How did you come to this realization?
Well, I came to the realization probably in the mid-1990s as I was trying to make sense out of all the data that I had collected from both my consciousness research and from my knowledge of physics and the way this physical reality worked. I was looking for a concept or an idea that would allow me to understand both areas, both the conscious research and the physics, seamlessly. You know, one overarching idea that explained both. And I found that eventually. It probably was about 1997, something around then, 7 or 8. And that was that this reality was virtual. That was the key that brought both of those research areas of mine together.
And so when you say virtual, can you give us an example? So you mean we're kind of living in a computer simulated reality? Is this what your theory is based on?
That's what virtual reality means. A virtual reality is a computed reality. It means that the reality itself is not physical like we think it is from being inside the virtual reality. We believe our universe is a physical universe, but it's a computed universe. It's a simulation, and we are basically players within that simulation. Now, back in the early or the middle 1990s, there was myself and a couple of other people who thought virtual reality was a real good idea, and one of them was a Dr. Edward Fredkin, a physicist, a pretty well-known and well-respected physicist, still working today. And he presented some papers in about that same time frame, claiming that from his research, which had nothing to do with consciousness, his research indicated that our reality was indeed virtual. In other words, a computed reality. And he presented these papers. I'm not quite sure how well they went over, but virtual reality was kind of in its infancy then. And since that time, in the last decade or decade and a half, experiment after experiment has pointed to the fact that this is a virtual reality. The only way to explain the results that physicists have been getting from their experiments lately is that this is a virtual reality. The idea that this is a reality of mass and charge and space and that sort of thing just won't, you can't compute the results of the experiment. You can't understand the experiment if you take that that initial condition. But if you think that reality is virtual, then the experiments become understandable. So more and more physicists are coming to the conclusion that indeed we're living in a computed virtual reality. In fact, it's pretty common now among the world's major universities. Physicists all over the planet are coming to this conclusion. It's not that this is a conclusion that they prefer or like, but it's that their experiments are dragging them into this viewpoint, kicking and screaming. It's really something that they don't really like so much because it's hard to explain, but that's what experiments are telling us. So the concept of virtual reality is one that says this is a computed reality. For instance, we used to think of an electron as a little ball of mass with a charge, and that described the electron. Now, physicists talk about the electron as a point with the attributes of mass and the attributes of charge. In other words, it's a informational description. It's the same way you would describe an electron in a computer simulation. You would put it at a position of a point, and you give it attributes of mass and charge. So we've kind of moved our viewpoint over the years from the little ball of mass with charge to a probability density of mass and charge, which was kind of the more modern viewpoint, to now just a computed informational quantity. So it's just the way physics has been moving for the last, I'll say, 15 years.
And I think one of the important points that you just said in that statement is that it had the attributes of mass, meaning not necessarily mass, but the attributes of it. And are you familiar with James Gates? He is a professor of physics at the University of Maryland, and he discovered strange computer code concealed in superstring equations and found that they weren't random code, but in fact intelligent code. So can you speak to that a little bit? Is that in keeping with what your model is?
Sure. That discovery that Gates made was that there was computer code. In other words, the instructions, the logic. Computer code is logic. The logic of computer code was clearly written in the equations of the string theory that he was studying. He is a string theorist. And I've heard him talk about this. He's made several lectures on it, and he says it's not that the string theory equations sort of look like code, look like lines of code that were written by a programmer. He says they are. They duplicate it exactly. And yes, this does help validate the idea that this is a virtual reality. That what it's saying is at the core, at the root, reality is computational. Okay, it's created by a computer. So lines of code sound like computer programming, and what he's saying is that he's seen artifacts of computer program code in string theory. So yes, now there'd be a lot of those details aren't entirely clear yet. It's basically he just said here it is, and other people have looked and they agree with him. So physicists today aren't quite sure what to make of that, but certainly it indicates that our world is computational. So
if I'm to understand you correctly, we are living in basically information. What consciousness all around us is basically just data. So I want you to speak to that a little bit, but if that is in fact the case, then who is ultimately writing the code, if you will? Where is consciousness? And if you could just describe a little bit about that.
Sure. Let me give a little viewpoint here of virtual reality and how it works. If you understand virtual reality in any of its forms, then you will understand it in all of its forms, because its basic structure is fundamental. Okay, so we look at a reality like World of Warcraft or The Sims. Either one would work. Or there's now dozens of virtual reality games out there for people to play. And pick one of these games. I tend to pick World of Warcraft because I'm familiar with that. Never played it, but my son and daughter both played it, so I've had many hours, watching them play World of Warcraft, so I understand it just a little bit. Anyway, in World of Warcraft, you have a computer computes this world, and the world has rocks and streams and rivers and sky. All the kind of things, houses, people, all sorts of characters. It's a multiplayer game, so there's hundreds of thousands of people logged on, and each one of them then is playing a character, which is called an avatar. So, for instance, if you were playing the World of Warcraft, you may be playing an elf. Okay, now there's a couple of things that we can note about any virtual reality. One thing is that the computer that creates this virtual world cannot reside inside the virtual world. In other words, if you're the elf in this World of Warcraft game, this game seems physical to you. The rocks and mountains and, houses, you have to open doors to go in the house. If you run into a tree, you get hurt. It has all of these same attributes, as many of the same attributes, I should say, as our physical reality. And to the elf, it's physical. Okay, but we know that the computer has to exist someplace else. It has to exist in a reality frame other than the World of Warcraft reality frame, because a simulation cannot compute itself. Now, besides that, this elf is an avatar. It has a player. We know that the player cannot exist inside the virtual reality. In other words, the player can't be in there with the elf. The player has to be outside of that reality frame, some other reality frame other than this virtual reality world of Warcraft. Now, that's just obvious sense. That makes sense. The computer and the player aren't inside the virtual reality that is created. What goes on there is that a player is the elf's consciousness. The player makes choices for the elf. And unless the player gives the elf an instruction, the elf just stands there and does nothing. It can't execute anything on its own. It just waits for instructions from the player. It's consciousness. Now, the player sends data to the computer, instructing the elf what to do. The computer then describes that action in terms of the virtual reality that it's describing. So then it sends data back to the player so that it displays on the player's screen what the elf is doing. So if the player said, "Elf, run to the right," then he looks at the screen and he sees that the computer is sending data to his screen showing the elf running to the right. So really what we have is three elements to virtual reality. We have the computer. We have the virtual reality itself, which is just ones and zeros on a computer hard drive. Now, these ones and zeros get updated a lot as the players make choices and send data to the computer. But it's just ones and zeros on a hard drive. It's a virtual reality, a computed reality. Then we have the player, the elf's consciousness. So those are the three elements. Only two are active. The player and the computer are in a constant stream of sending information back and forth. The player says, "Elf, move," and the computer shows the elf moving in the virtual reality and does that by sending a data stream back to the player, and that displays on the player's screen. That data, that screen is just a bunch of dots of color and intensity, and those are called pixels of the screen, and the player looks at all those dots of colored pixels and interprets that as the world that the elf lives in, as the World of Warcraft world. Okay, so a few things then that we can take those fundamental attributes of virtual reality and apply them to himself. So we now live in a virtual reality. If that's true, and that's what physicists are coming to terms with, that's what they are thinking is likely to be the case now, then our body, our brain, our physical world, this whole physical universe, I put physical in quotes, is actually computed. It's a virtual reality, virtual body, virtual brain, and our body is the avatar. Our consciousness is the player. And we know that the player and the computer cannot be part of this physical universe, cannot be inside of the virtual reality that they create. That means that not only are we, our bodies and our brains and so on, the trees, the rocks, all the planets, all the stars, all of this physical universe, not only is this virtual and that we are an avatar, but that the player and the computer must reside outside this reality we think is physical in some other reality, which then would be, by definition, non-physical, which means not part of this physical world. So now we have something that is non-physical to us, that is primary, that is fundamental, and we are derived from it. Okay, so the first question, as you mentioned, that the person would make is, well, if that's the case, who's the programmer? Who's programming all of this?
Right.
Well, there is and there is not a programmer, and let me explain that. So the consciousness, that is the player, and the computer have to be in the same reality frame. They have to be of the same fundamental reality. They have to share a frame because they're passing data back and forth, which means they can't do that across different reality frames. They do that within the same reality frame. So I call that reality frame, that non-physical frame, the larger consciousness system. Okay, now, the larger consciousness system is an information system, a digital information system. And part of it serves the purpose of the computer, and part of it that is separate and independent, given separateness, given independence, and given free will, that's the consciousness. So it's all consciousness. The computer is a subset of consciousness, the player is a subset of consciousness, and the whole thing is called the larger consciousness system. Now, our virtual reality, our physical universe, is not programmed in the same way that, say, World of Warcraft is. Every tree, every flower, every house, every creature in World of Warcraft had to be programmed. Somebody had to sit down and write code to make that tree be right where it is and make it look like it looks. That's not true in our reality. Our reality isn't programmed detail by detail like that. Our reality is evolved. Okay, it started with initial conditions. Let's say a very small ball of plasma under very high pressure and temperature. And then it has a rule set, the rules by which energy exchanges take place and how things interact. The run button is hit, and the simulation starts. And when it starts, time starts to tick from t equals 0 to, t equals 0 plus delta t. It's a little chunk of time. And the tight ball of plasma with lots of pressure and temperature starts to expand. It cools eventually. The cooling matter forms suns, and we have now the Big Bang. So it's a big digital bang, if you will. And the initial state of the Big Bang, before it banged, were just the initial conditions in this computer simulation. And again, the simulation progresses because of the rule set. That rule set would be what we call science, physics, chemistry, biology, how things work, how energy exchanges, how things relate to each other. So we had this start, this initial conditions. It started to evolve, and eventually we got a virtual universe that we now call our physical universe. And eventually in that virtual universe there was a planet called Earth, eventually called Earth, and it evolved life forms, and those life forms grow up to be like us, and they have virtual realities of their own. So that kind of gives us the whole perspective of how it works. So yes, there is a programmer in the sense that somebody had to come up with the initial conditions in the rule set, and I'm sure that took lots of trial and error before they finally got a rule set that was stable. Mm-hmm. But when they did, then they just hit the run button and let this virtual reality we call our home, this physical universe, evolve on its own. And it's still evolving, as is the larger consciousness system. The system itself is not an infinite system. It's finite, and it has its own job to do, and that is evolve. And all of this is tied together in a way that's probably a long story. Maybe we'll get to that later, but I think I've answered your immediate question anyhow.
Yes, you did. And we are just going to pause there for a brief message, and we'll be right back. Okay, for those of you who are just joining us, we are speaking with Tom Campbell. He is the author of My Big T.O.E. trilogy. It's the theory of everything. He is a former NASA nuclear physicist who has been explaining consciousness, or exploring, I should say, consciousness, for over 35 years. And he has a fascinating model of the universe and how everything works and basically who we are and why we're here, etc. When we left off, we were just talking about the model of the world being this virtual reality, computer simulated type of existence. And that spurs a lot of questions based on what you were just saying, Tom, about this being some type of reality that's similar to a game's. The point of it to be our evolution. My question would be, has consciousness ever been beyond where we are currently? Had it ever, meaning, does it play a game, and then the game, like you were saying, has its natural finite conclusion, and then there's another game created, if you will, or another simulation? So what can you go into a little bit of that? Like, are we in a game? Are there more than one game? Does the game end? And what's the point?
Okay, that's a good last question. What's the point? That's a real important one. But yes, there are many games in process, just like there are many. You have World of Warcraft, and you have The Sims, and you have a dozen others that have come up in the last few years. And this larger consciousness system creates this game for a reason. Creates this, I call it a virtual reality entropy reduction trainer. And here's why the larger conscious system needed to create it. Okay, the system, as I said, is an information system, because consciousness is really about information. Now, this might make more sense to you if you think about what your reality is to you. What is your reality? Well, just look around. It's what you see, it's what you hear, it's what you smell, right? It's what your senses tell you. That is your reality. That's our sense of this whole universe. It's what we see. We look with big telescopes. It's what we see. Well, what would our reality be without our senses? Take all five senses away from us, and what would reality be? Well, there would be no reality like this. You couldn't feel anything, you couldn't see anything or hear anything. You would just be a point of awareness floating in a black void. That's all you would be. So our reality is defined by our senses, and our senses basically just collect information. See, that photon of light hits your retina, and when it does that, an electrical pulse runs down your optic nerve, and that pulse then modifies neurons in your central nervous system. Well, all of that is digital information. The electric pulse is information. The neurons, they're all discrete pieces of information. And when we say it's discrete rather than continuous, that means that it's digital. That's what digital means. It comes in digits, in chunks. So our reality that we are conscious of, our awareness, is based upon our senses. And our senses are just data streams. They're just information that we gather. Okay, so it's not such a strange idea that consciousness should be thought of as an information system. That's what it's all about. That's what to be conscious means. It means you can communicate, that you can get information and send information. You communicate. That's the nature of consciousness.
But
so here we have...
Let me just interject for 1 second. What are we doing, or what is the collector of all this data doing with it?
Okay. So we have this larger conscious system that's an information system. Now, information systems, and this is just standard physics of information systems evolve by lowering their entropy. Now, entropy is a physics term that means a measure of disorder. So imagine you have bits. Now we're talking information now. If all the bits are random, there is no information. If the bits become ordered in some specific way, and that order has meaning, that's information. So a information system evolves by creating information. In other words, by creating order where there otherwise would be randomness, by ordering those bits and creating information. So an information system either evolves by creating more information, more structure, more content, or it de-evolves by letting that structure and content dissipate in the randomness. So an information system is much like us. It can evolve, it can de-evolve, and in the process of evolving, of course, it survives. It continues on. It can lower its entropy still more and create more complex, more ordered sets of information that it finds useful to itself. So this information system has the same problem we do. It's like evolve or die. Our species must evolve, continue on, find a way to survive and procreate, or die and go away. The information system has to be able to lower its entropy or de-evolve and raise its entropy to where all the bits are random, and then it dies. Now, in order to lower its entropy, it has to create order, it has to create structure. Now, it's hard to do that when there's just chunks of consciousness. Now, this one big, larger conscious system realizes that in order to lower its entropy, it would be easier if it wasn't just one monolithic thing. If it could interact with other things, there would be a lot more novelty, a lot more construction, a lot more structure that it could create. So it subdivides itself into pieces. These pieces I call individuated units of consciousness, and that's what you and I are. We're actually consciousness, and we're the player of this avatar we call our physical body. But now these individuated units of consciousness needed to build structure. They needed to learn how to lower their entropy. And lowering your entropy in a social system, which is what all these communicating chunks of consciousness are, means to cooperate, to work together. Okay, we talk a little bit more about that. But so here we have a bunch of consciousnesses, small consciousnesses, and they're talking to each other, and they're supposed to create structure. They're supposed to create meaning, but yet all they can do is pass data back and forth. That doesn't work very well. So the system says we need a little more traction here on the communication, something that enables us to know what our communication, what effect did it have, and what are the effects of others upon us. And, interaction has to be defined somehow rather than just passing data back and forth. So the way to do that was to create a virtual reality with a tight rule set like ours so that we could play avatars, and in this virtual reality, we would have feedback. The meaning and the structure of our thoughts and what we're doing and our beliefs and whether we are cooperative or not would now have consequences in this virtual reality, because it's more than just a big chat room with information going back and forth. Now there's a tight rule set that keeps track of causality and what happens and why it happens, you see. So that's why the larger conscious system needed a rule set. It needed to create a rule set and initial conditions to evolve a virtual reality so that its sub-pieces, its individuated units of consciousness, could interact with each other in a way that was more meaningful than just sharing data. So that's the point of this virtual reality. It serves as an entropy reduction trainer so that the individual units and the whole consciousness system together can evolve, live, rather than de-evolve, return to randomness. Now one more point,
Go ahead.
One more little thing, and that is if you have a social structure of individuated units of consciousness, as it turns out, the optimal way for those individuated units of consciousness to interact with each other is one, as I said, of cooperation, of caring, of being helpful to one another. So I call that the love side. That's the side that fundamentally cares about other. It's not the self-centered side. The opposite side to that is the fear side. And on the fear side, we have individuated units that if they were fearful, basically they need to make sure that they get what they need and what they want, and nobody else takes that away from them. There's very little trust. There's very little cooperation, and so on. So that then, I could work this out in more detail, but we really don't have a lot of time here. Right. What it boils down to is that the purpose of reducing entropy that these individuated units of entropy are doing in this virtual reality we call our physical universe, their purpose is to grow up, become love, because that optimizes their entropy reduction. So it's about it's about cooperation and caring. Then that's the optimal configuration, and that's what we are evolving toward here. That's our purpose, and we are, you might say, the larger consciousness system's strategy for staying alive, for evolving its consciousness. And another way to say that is raising the quality of its consciousness. We could also say spiritual growth, if we were coming from that side. Anyway, so that's our point. That's why we're here. That's why there's a virtual reality. That's why it had to be created, and that's its point, and that's our point.
So if all that exists is consciousness, and the purpose is to evolve and to evolve back into that place of love, if you will, doesn't that then imply that there's a separation? Meaning, if all that exists is consciousness, wouldn't love already be contained in that? So what are we evolving to if we're already that?
No, well, what we have is that there is the potential to become love. If you are consciousness, you are a piece of an information system. Okay, you have memory, you process, which means you can learn. You have a purpose, which is to lower your entropy or grow up or become love, however you want to say that, increase the quality of your consciousness. So you are also part of this information system, okay? And you have the potential to grow up and become love, but you're not there yet. You're just you're just a new piece of consciousness, say. And what you get to do is make choices. Okay? Consciousness and free will are logically necessary for each other. You can't have consciousness without free will. You can't have free will without consciousness. Without free will, consciousness really has nothing to do if it can't make a choice. It's basically nothing, doesn't exist. And, free will by itself without consciousness has no meaning. Free will to do what? It's the consciousness that makes the choice. So those two go together. So you have free will, and you get to make choices. And by those choices, you either evolve or de-evolve the quality of your consciousness. And that's why we are in this virtual reality entropy reduction trainer we call our physical universe.
So has consciousness ever been, in your opinion, more evolved than it currently is? Meaning, was there a society ever that was existing either in some Earth type of virtual reality existence that was evolved, that realized itself as love, and then something happened or there was a natural conclusion?
No, it's been evolving. The larger consciousness system, of course, like any real system, has its ups and downs. There's been times when there's been pieces of it that have evolved very well and times when there's pieces of it that haven't. But if we look at the whole thing and just take a kind of an average level of entropy for the whole system, it has been steadily evolving from a higher consciousness system to a lower consciousness system. So though pieces of it may have gotten evolved more rapidly than others and then maybe dissipated, that's kind of local changes that happen. But in general, the whole system has been evolving. So we have been going from higher entropy to lower entropy. We're becoming more love-like as time goes on. Now, as an example, if you look at the newspapers and watch the TV, you'd say, wow, I don't see a whole lot of love out there. It doesn't look too good. I see a lot of meanness and self-centeredness and people trying to take advantage of each other. That's true. But when we look at it from being in it at the time now, it seems like it's a pretty awful place. But just look back, an eye blink in the evolution of the human animal. Just go back 300 years. We've been evolving for millions of years. So just 300 years, the very eye blink in our evolution, we see things are much, much kinder and gentler now in general for the majority of people than they were then. It used to be a very rough place. Life was very uncertain, and life was cheap, as they say. That's not the case anymore. We have been evolving and making some progress. And the good thing about progress is that the progress you make helps you make more progress. So the whole thing tends to accelerate. That's why in just 300 years we've made big strides that would have maybe been millennia, many millennia, to get as far as we were 300 years ago. And now we've done more than that in just a couple of centuries. So the whole thing is growing, and the whole thing is evolving, and so are we. Even though when you look out the window, you realize that we've got a long way yet to go.
Well, we sure do have it seems like we have a long way to go. So along those lines then, if we are living in a kind of a computer-written reality, just like a computer can get a virus, can our greater consciousness program also get a virus and throw us off the course of our evolution?
No. The larger consciousness system is a computing system, is an information system that is kind of beyond our comprehension in many ways. And I don't think that a virus is the kind of problem that we should worry about. We should worry about whether or not we're actually evolving the quality of our consciousness and doing what we're supposed to be doing here, rather than that there's something wrong with the system. The system will work, has been working for, in our time it would be, billions of years. So it's pretty much worked out, the details. And it's not like it has a lot of malevolent users out there trying to, create havoc. It's the whole system.
Well, that's good to hear that there's not a lot of malevolence in the system. Do you think that this greater consciousness system is that which people call God or refer to as God?
Well, yes, it certainly may be. It depends on the person, using the word God. I don't use that word in my books or in my talks because it means something different to everybody. But if you're one of those people who can use the word God and not be referring to any sort of dogma, no sort of, rituals and creeds and things you have to believe and so on, then the larger consciousness system makes a pretty good model of that sort of God. Because the larger consciousness system, it's finite, it's not infinite, it's not perfect. There are, it's a very large system, so there are occasionally, problems and issues, not really viruses, but just it's a large system to keep track of. So there are glitches here and there that have to be taken care of, or rules that have to be followed and sometimes aren't, and so on. Not a perfect system, not an infinite system. It's, belief is the enemy. In consciousness, belief is a bad thing, not a good thing. Belief limits what you can learn. If you believe that something's true, you're no longer open to understanding or getting or processing new information about it. So belief is kind of the enemy. You need to get rid of that. You need to get rid of the fear and rid of the ego. Actually, fear creates ego and fear creates belief. So we get rid of the fear and ego, belief, expectation, that sort of thing.
Boy, we would all love to get rid of the fear. Tom, we're just going to hold right there, take a short break, and we'll be right back. Okay, for those of you who are just joining us, we are with Tom Campbell, and he is discussing his book, My Big T.O.E., which is My Big Theory of Everything, about reality being a virtual reality. So, Tom, right before we left off, we were talking about endings of games, etc., and my question would be, what happens after we die?
Okay, well, remember now, your body that dies is just a virtual body. It's just like that elf. What happens when your elf dies? Well, generally, it's not a real big deal. In that game, they have this rule set where you run back to the graveyard, find your elf there. Your elf runs back out to where he died and left all his equipment and money and everything, picks it all up, and is right back in the game again. Okay, and the reason that, of course, they make the game that way is if your elf died and that was the end of your play, people would wouldn't like that. Those elves die a lot in World of Warcraft, so it would be a nuisance to have to start over every time your elf died, since that happens probably 6 or 7 times every time you play for a few hours. So they made it such that you recycle, and we do the same thing. So what happens when your avatar dies? You, of course, are consciousness, and the player that you're playing, this avatar, has to follow the rule set, and the rule set includes biology, and this system doesn't last forever. It gets old and wears out, and the avatar dies. When that happens, you, the consciousness, okay, who have been embedded, you might say, in that avatar. It's not like when we play World of Warcraft where we can take a break, put it on hold, and go make a sandwich, and then come back later after a snack and continue playing again. You are immersed. You are a piece of consciousness immersed in this reality frame. And you've been immersed with that avatar since its very beginning. So you are not aware of all the rest of the consciousness, even though you're a piece of it, because you've been wholly immersed in this avatar. So when the avatar dies, you find yourself aware in another reality frame. And it's like, oh, what's this? And then there is this reality frame, I call it the transition reality frame, that helps you get adjusted, tries to keep the level of your fear down, and it does that through several methodologies. It could pose as your relatives that have already preceded you to the grave, and they might meet and greet like a Walmart greeter and kind of welcome you there and make you feel more at ease. The whole idea is to get you to relax. Your remembrance of the world you just left starts to fade just like a dream. You know how when you wake up from a dream, it's perfectly clear for the first 10 seconds, and yes. 2 or 3 minutes later, it's a little fuzzy, and half an hour later, you can just barely remember that you had the dream, but all the details are gone. That's the way it is after you die. This experience is perfectly clear for a while, and then it begins to fade, and eventually it's just a very vague sense that you had some sort of experience or another, but you don't really remember any of the details. At that time, you're given an option, you're given a choice to find another avatar, get back in the game, because you still have much to learn. So if you've been around a few times, you may decide just what sort of situation you need in order to help you evolve the things you need to evolve, deal with the problems and issues you have. Then you go get immersed again with another avatar, and it starts all over. So I call these experience cycles, and you go through these various experience cycles or experience packets, one after the other, because learning and growing is a cumulative thing. You can't take kindergarten, first, second, third, all the way up through college all in the same year. It doesn't work. You can't parallel process learning. First, you have to learn, to add and subtract, and then you learn to multiply and divide, and then you learn algebra, and then you learn calculus, and you have to learn the basics before you learn things that are built on those basics. It's the same way with learning to become love. There's very basic things that you have to learn first. It goes in steps. So we have to go through these experience packets over and over again until we evolve ourselves successfului. So that's what goes on. Now, some religions will call that reincarnation.
Right.
That I guess is a good enough term, but it's a logical requirement of this theory because learning is cumulative. There's no way to do it in one shot.
So as we are growing and learning, whether it's lifetime after lifetime or whatever your belief system is, to evolve into love, which I love that. I think that's a beautiful goal to work towards. Is there going to be a natural conclusion to this Earth game does it end, or does it just continue in infinity?
Well, evolution is an open-ended thing. Evolution doesn't have an end point. The evolution doesn't work until you get to a certain point, and then it says, I'm done. There's always, as long as there are possibilities for change, there's always possibilities for further optimization. And as conditions change, the choices change with it. So the decision space or the choices we have are constantly changing based on, us changing. So in that sense, it just keeps going on. But there is we can follow the pattern and say, well, where is this evolution taking us? What's the pattern? Well, we can see this pattern, and I'll just kind of throw this in. I'm not going to derive it here, but this reality frame is a fractal. It's what I call a process fractal. We have a process. The process is evolution, and the media in which that process takes place is consciousness. And when you iterate on a process in a media, you create a fractal, just like if you iterate on a geometric shape. In a mathematical process, you get a geometric fractal. Well, this is a process fractal. So we can see a lot of similarity amongst evolution, things that have evolved. They evolve through the same kind of processes. So let's look at our biological processes, and that'll give us some information about where we as a planet, as a people, as human beings, where we're going, and what will our goal look like? Well, if we looked at biological things, they started very simple, little one-celled critters, and that's all we had. We call those bacteria. And then those bacteria realized that they could lower their entropy if they, just like consciousness, had something more interactive, something that they could build and construct, something more complex, more order. So they divided and became multicelled critters. And the multicelled critters started to take over because they were lower entropy, they were more survivable, and they decided that they could evolve by cooperating. And they cooperated, and they became cells with specialization. That means they had the locomotion part, and the administration part, the digestion part, the defense part. All of the various parts of a more complex, more structured critter were specialized now. Not just a couple of cells doing everything, but some cells just doing special things. Well, we're one of those multi-celled critters with specialized parts. All of our organs, our skin, our liver, all these things have parts to play. All right, now what's the next step? Well, the next step is for us. Now we're going to switch out of biology. The next step is for us as a human species and as kind of the caretakers of the planet, if you will, is to become love, to care about each other, to let go of our self-centeredness. And when we do that, we're going to form something bigger. We will form another multi-celled creature where we are the cells in the creature. Now, that doesn't mean that humans are going to bond together, their shoulders are going to grow together and make one big monolithic monster of some sort. When it gets up to our level, it's at the mental level, and we get to create an organization of caring individuals that will be so much more effective and more optimal and more productive in every way. There'll be more individual freedom. There'll be more choices. It'll just be a richer environment all the way around. So we are going to create that, and that will make us then, humanity, all the other critters that live on this planet, and the trees and bushes and Earth itself, are all going to be part of this one organism, if you will. Multi-celled, where the cells aren't joined together, but the cells are separate, thinking, independent beings. Well, at least some of them are. You still have rocks and trees and other things that are going to be a part of this. So we, the planet, become one happy family. And that sounds like a good idea, doesn't it?
That sounds like a great idea.
So that's where we're going, and we will get there eventually, because evolution isn't it takes its time. It eventually gets to where it's going. It may take us another couple of millennia to make it, or it may only take us, 20 or 30 years. It's hard to say, but that's what we're working toward, and we will achieve that one day, because everything else is higher entropy, and a system evolves by moving to states of lower entropy, and that's where we need to end up. So then what happens? Let's say that we do that, and we're one happy family here on this planet called Gaia, and perhaps there are other planets around, and maybe we have to go through this same process again, where we learn to cooperate and get along with and include and care about all other planets in our galaxy. And then there's other galaxies in the world, and maybe we have to do that again. It's hard to say where this might stop, but it's not going to stop anytime soon. This is kind of far-reaching. But whether it's just us on the planet Earth, or whether there's us and other planets and other galaxies and stuff, that'll all play out into the future. But for right now, our job is to evolve to become love, to care about others, to get rid of our fear, our ego, and our beliefs. That's what we're here for. And as we do that, we will begin to form this one happy family on this planet of cooperative, interactive people. And no, that won't mean that each of us is just a cog in a big wheel or a big machine. We will have individually more freedom, more choices than we have today.
And for a species who we think are so evolved, some people, we find ourselves thinking we're so evolved, but it really just sounds like we're in our infancy in this whole process, and that love really is the answer, and not in an airy-fairy, hocus-pocus kind of way, but genuinely love is the catalyst that will continue our evolutionary process. And yes. So I would say that would be the big takeaway today in all of this. Is there anything else that, there's been a lot of information for our listeners today, Tom, but now that we know we're in this virtual reality simulation, how do we apply that, if you will, to our lives, just briefly, if you can?
Okay, I will. This is not just, cosmology, big theory about how everything is and, where it's going. If that were the case, it wouldn't be very useful, except as, things to think about on a rainy day. But this is very personal to everybody. We have a mission here. We have a purpose for our being here, and it's to become love. And most of us aren't very close to that yet. And you can tell. I'll give you a little bit of instruction on how to make that work for you. You can tell that you're not all love if you have ego. Because that's fear. Fear makes ego. Ego and beliefs and expectations, they all are products of fear. So if in your life, in your day-to-day living, you ever have negative feelings, you feel anxious, upset, angry, unsatisfied, that sort of thing, anything that we call a negative feeling, that negative feeling is attached to your ego. If you didn't have any ego, then you wouldn't feel that negative feeling. And many people would say, well, sure I would. So-and-so did this to me. Well, it's not that so-and-so forces you to do that. You choose to feel that negativity. It's your choice. You could choose other than that. So, we have to take responsibility for our choices. We choose how we react and how we interact with things. So, if you have those negative feelings, that's your ego. Well, look at that negative feeling and say, where does that come from? Why do I have that negative feeling? Why is it? And you trace it back to a fear of some sort. And that fear is what we need to get rid of. And what you will find, that if you do this process, find your ego, get rid of the fear, the ego will diminish and the fear will diminish, and you will find that instead of life being a perpetual challenge, perpetual, steep hill that you have to constantly work to keep going up, you will find that life is just joyful. It's just really nice that your relationships improve and get much, much better, that you're a happy camper. Life is good. Everything works real well for you, and you have a lot of satisfaction. It just can't, I can't overstate that. Life is just a good thing when you get rid of the fear. It's the fear that causes our pain. It's the fear that causes all that negativity. So if you would like to live in a joyful, happy world, then what you need to do is start getting rid of that fear. And it's a hard thing to do, but you can do it. It just takes focus on an intent to do it, and you just have to keep working at it until you get it done. It's hard, but it gets easier. Every time you get rid of a fear, you feel the weight coming off your shoulders, and it's easier to get rid of the next one. That first one is the hardest one.
Yes,
so just work on that. Get rid of that fear. Get rid of that ego. Make it so it's not about you. You see, most of us, we put the emphasis on the wrong thing. What we do is we spend all of our time trying to control what happens. We want our kids to grow up and be healthy and, go to college and become professionals, and we want our boss to appreciate our work, and we want our spouse to appreciate us, and on and on and on. We want to control what happens to us. So we look at the possibilities and we try to manipulate and posture and somehow work it all out so that it happens the way we want it. And all of that is ego. A much better way to be is let what happens, happens. That doesn't mean that you can't plan how you're going to pay your mortgage. Of course, you still have to plan, but I think you know what I mean. Right. Anyway, you let stuff happen, and then you deal with it, because what's important is how do you deal with it. You see, it's not that important what happens. What happens is how do you deal with it. And if you deal with it with love and with caring, then you evolve the quality of your consciousness. If you deal with it with fear, you de-evolve. So that's where the rubber meets the road, is in how do you deal with these things. Yes, you have to be aware of what's happening. Yes, you have to plan. Yes, you want to raise your kids to give them the best chance possible. I don't mean you just kick back and don't worry about anything. You have responsibility, and you need to meet those responsibilities and do the best you can with them. But rather than trying to manipulate everything to be the way you want it to be, it's better to be responsible, do your part, and then deal with the consequences with love rather than with fear. And if you do that, you will optimize your growth. That's the way to lower your entropy.
Well, it's like that phrase, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. And I tell you, it's one of the things that I work on releasing on a daily basis. And it can be so subtle, the way that it creeps in and creeps up, and you feel so justified sometimes in your positions. But even in that, there's fear as well. So
Absolutely.
Just one last question, Tom, and then we have to go. So when someone asks you, "Who are you?" what is your answer?
Well, depends on why they're asking, because you can't tell people something more than they're ready to hear.
True.
So that's all you can do. So it depends on just what they're asking and why they're doing that. But if it's somebody who really wanted to understand, I'd explain to them that I'm not this physical body. I'm consciousness, and that I have a purpose to my life, and that's how I would describe myself. All of us are in this same boat. We come in with whatever the quality is that we've earned up to this point. We do the best we can, and with what we've got, and that's it. So wherever you are in this process of evolving, that's the same story for everyone. So it's the same story for me and for you and everybody else. We're doing the best we can with what we've got. It's just better. We can be more effective if we know what the game is, rather than just wandering around in the playing field, wondering, what's going on. So that's why it helps if you understand the nature of reality, how it works, why you're here, because then you can start focusing on
Becoming love.
Fulfilling your purpose, becoming love. Exactly. So that's the idea.
Well, Tom, thank you so much. This has just been fascinating, informative. It was deep. I certainly hope that our listeners could follow along with it. And if they want to get more information or read into this more, or how can they reach you? What's your website?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that, because what I've done is I've just skipped very superficially over the top of a whole lot of stuff and just kind of made statements without deriving them. But if you really want the logical derivations, if you'd like to see the science behind all these things I'm talking about, you can find my books for free on Google Books, or if you want to purchase them from all the usual sources. I have around 200 videos now on YouTube. So go to my YouTube channel. You can just go to Google and Google Thomas Campbell or Google My Big T.O.E, and you will find it. That's the easy way to find it. Also, you can go to MBT Events. That's www.mbtevents to find out where I'm going to be talking next and what's on my schedule for travel and programs. So those would be the places: the books, the videos, and the MBT events.
Well, I certainly thank you again. This has just been wonderful. And so we're going to conclude there. I encourage all of our listeners to go be loved today. Love yourself, love each other. Thank you so much.